Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Ben Saunders, Associate Professor of English at the University of Oregon. Saunders specializes in the poetry and drama of the English Renaissance. His published work explores the intersection of spirituality and sexuality during that period, along with larger questions of literary hermeneutics. His other teaching and research interests include poetry and poetics more generally, literary theory, the history of pornography, Anglo-American popular music, and comic book superheroes. He also occasionally moonlights as an actor and a musician. Saunders is the author of Rock Over the Edge, Transformations in Popular Music Culture, published in 2002, the author of Desiring Done, Poetry, Sexuality, Interpretation, which came out in 2006, and he's working on a forthcoming book entitled Does God Wear a Cape? Spirituality, Fantasy, and Superheroes. Saunders organized Understanding Superheroes, an interdisciplinary conference, which will be held at the University of Oregon on October 23rd and 24th. In conjunction with this conference, he also served as a curator for the exhibit Faster Than a Speeding Bullet, The Art of the Superhero, which is showing at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. The exhibit runs from September 26, 2009 through January 23, 2010. Ben, welcome to UO Today.
Hi, Barbara.
It's a great way to start the year talking about superheroes, so thanks for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you.
Before we get to the substance of the show and the conference, I have to ask you what your personal interest is. What led you to this?
I probably do what I do as a professor of literature because of my early exposure to comic books. Contrary to what people used to think a long time ago, that comics rot the brain, I think increasingly people are recognizing that they have a very important educational function. And my grandmother bought me my first Spider-Man comic when I was about 6 years old. And well, I fell down the rabbit hole and I never came back.
I wasn't allowed to read them as a child, so I've always had a particular interest in them because they were the forbidden fruit for me. So I'm very interested in what you're doing. Your work on this, the conference and the exhibit this fall points out two really big different aspects of comic book studies. There's the visual side and there is comic books as literature. Could we start by talking about the exhibit?
Sure.
I'm interested to know what inspired you to assemble this collection of comic book art.
Sure. Well, in recent years, comic books have been getting something of a better press from our institutions of art and culture. There have been, comic books have been awarded some major literary prizes. There have been exhibitions of comic art. But by and large, the focus has been on what you might call comics lit. Art Spiegelman's Mouse with the confessional aspects and the story of a Holocaust survivor, or as was recently held at UCLA Hammer Museum, there was an exhibition called Masters of American Comic Art, which did travel nationally, and that featured work by people like Robert Crumb or Charles Schulz, Spiegelman himself. The focus has not been, I'm very glad the exhibition happened, the Hammer exhibition, and think they did important groundbreaking work, but for me it's a little like having a symposium on film and then deciding that you're going to talk about John Waters and Steven Spielberg and Sam Peckinpah all on the same day. These artists are united only by the fact that they did comics. Everything else about their work is completely different. And they don't even do the same kinds of comics. Newspaper comic strips are entirely different animal, really, from the comic book. It's like comparing poetry to prose. You have 3 or 4 panels to tell your story as opposed to, maybe a 20-page story. So, I wanted to see an exhibition of Masters of Comic Art that had a few images of Batman in it. It just made sense to me that if you're talking about Masters of Comic Art, the superheroes need to be represented. The attitude towards genre work, I think we're still a little behind here in terms of our scholarly appreciation of all the genres within comics, not just superheroes, but war comics, romance comics, science fiction comics, horror comics, Western comics. There are many, many genres besides the more biographical, confessional, high art comics that have received more scholarly attention. So that was the initial impulse. Let's narrow the focus. Let's talk about the most popular genre in American comics, and let's look at its history. It's 70 years worth of material.
I know that when you began to look for material to display, you found a lot more than you thought you were going to be able to assemble.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. It's really lucky that we have the material that we have, because for many years the art was not valued at all, even by the publishers, and in some cases even by the creators. Its commercial value was as work to be reproduced, and once the comic was available, the original art had a kind of a secondary value. And once upon a time you could pick up these pages from the artists if they had been returned to them by the companies for maybe between $15 and $50. $50 was high end as long ago as not all that long ago, actually, probably even in the 1960s or early 70s. But the very early art was destroyed by the companies. They had nowhere to warehouse it, or kept in places where there wasn't a lot of security, and a lot of it has vanished over the years. So finding original art from particularly the so-called golden age of comics, the 1940s and 50s, this stuff is extraordinarily rare. And I did manage to find a couple of collectors, a gentleman named Ethan Roberts, who has been collecting since 1963. He was given his first page of art for free at a comic book convention in 1963. And he had over 800 pages in a variety of genres and gave us permission to take whatever we wanted. So we have quite a few pages from him. Another one of our principal lenders is a man named David Mandel, who's actually the executive producer of Curb Your Enthusiasm, the Larry David show. He has probably the most extraordinary collection of modern age superhero art, I think, maybe in the country. He has a number of so-called grail pieces, really highly prized collectible pieces. Iconic covers, like things like the cover of the first appearance of the new X-Men, or an early Daredevil cover by Frank Miller, who is quite well known now as both a filmmaker and a comic artist. And all of those pieces will be in the show.
So the very ephemeral nature of this kind of artwork means that now it's even more valuable than one might have imagined.
It's so it's the collectibles market in the last 10 or 15 years has way outpaced any rational calculus, so that it would now be not unusual if it's a. It's an interesting area to collect, because a lot of these artists, they may have drawn thousands of pages over their career, but it's when they were drawing the characters that they're most famous for that the pages are most desirable. And then let's take, for example, Steve Ditko on Spider-Man. Steve Ditko had a 40-year comic book career, and his characters that he's most famous for are Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. He only drew them for a few years in the 1960s, and when he left them, he's refused to draw them since. He's quite a principled gentleman who, he's still alive, he's in his 80s, lives in New York, and he's been offered lots of money to just do sketches of either of those characters, Spider-Man or Doctor Strange, and he won't do it. So the only way to see his original art is to own one of those original pages. And those pieces are obviously worth a lot more than a standard page of Steve Ditko art doing another one of those characters. So it's not just the artist, it's the artist and character combination. In the show we will have an entire 20-page Spider-Man story by Steve Ditko, featuring the Green Goblin. It's one of the most prized pieces that we have, and it's a remarkable thing to be able to read a whole story in that format. The art is about twice the size of the comic. The production techniques of the comic were pretty shoddy, and then it has those Ben-Day color dots placed over the art later, so that when you take that away and you look at it at its larger size, there are all kinds of detail in the background that are lost in the reproduced form. that you can see for the first time when you actually see the original art. And an obvious question is, why were the artists doing this when it wouldn't even show up when the work was printed? And they're doing it for themselves. They're doing it for their own aesthetic pleasure and the joy they take as craftsmen. But you can see expressions on the faces of the characters in the backgrounds in this Spider-Man book that I've never seen before.
So how are they exhibited at the Jordan Schnitzer? Must be a difficult medium to work with.
It is, because you have to, there are no standard sizes for the very early work, for the newspaper comics, which we're beginning the show with. See, before there were superhero comics and comic books, there are newspaper comics, and that's a really different form. And I didn't want to be overly distracted by it, but I felt that the audience should see at least some examples of newspaper adventure strips before they saw comic book art. Because it was the newspaper adventure strips of the 1930s that really inspired the early creators of superheroes. And those pieces, I'm thinking particularly of a Prince Valiant page that we have by Hal Foster, a Flash Gordon page by the original artist Alex Raymond. Those pieces were not standardly sized, and they're big. They go back to when newspapers were giant broadsheets that you read almost by lying on the floor. And they're just gorgeous works of art with extraordinarily rendered detail, all done by hand, usually in brushwork, ink and brush. I mean, Foster is supposed to have labored for as much as 60 hours a week on one Sunday page. So that's that stuff we've had to, everything gets framed at a different size. And just arranging it on the wall so that you can see it at a distance but still get close enough to see that detail. These are all questions that you have to think about. Fortunately, I don't have to think too hard about them. The staff at the Schnitzer are much more experienced than I am dealing with this kind of thing, and I think they're doing a remarkable job.
It sounds as though there is going to be a whole series of events throughout the fall and on into January when the show closes that goes with this display.
That's right.
There's a web page, I believe, that people can look at.
Yes, I would not be able to hold all the dates in my head. We have so many events going on during the fall related to this exhibition and to the conference. But if people go to the website for the Jordan Schnitzer Museum, there are pages where they can register for the conference, and there is information about the exhibition with all the press releases and also about our various talks. I know that we have one of our own U of O law professors, Don Betry, will be talking about the copyright issues around the Superman character, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. It's actually a textbook case of copyright law and the confusions that can emerge from copyright law. We will have Douglas Wolk and Peter Coogan, who are both independent comic scholars, will be talking about the essence of the superhero. And Gail Simone, who's the current writer of Wonder Woman, will be doing a Q&A session with Andy Mangels, talking about how she herself got into comics and the Wonder Woman character.
So let's talk a little bit about the conference, which will happen October 23rd, 24th. That's a separate event, but obviously associated with the exhibit. What's the focus of the conference itself?
Yeah, well, if the exhibition is to allow people to really see the visual dynamics of the form and the genre, the conference allows people to talk, as inevitably you want to do, about the content, the mythic nature of the content. Superhero stories are one of the reasons I think that they are so fascinating is the same reason that most people are embarrassed by them, and I think the reason why there's a kind of self-deprecating fan culture around them, a sort of admitted, yes, I'm a geek posture that people will take, and a much more cynical attitude that non-fans will generally take in the media, a kind of joking about people wearing costumes and that kind of thing. I think the reason for this desire to almost create a distance between oneself and the material is that because superhero comics are naked power fantasies. The aspects of wish fulfillment are so obvious that it's almost embarrassing to admit that you're that interested in material that is so adolescent in its wish fulfillment impulses. Everybody has an idealized body, everyone has these absurd powers which supposedly can make everything go right. It's almost like, you know, that old cartoon comic strip about Charles Atlas weightlifting or something, where which was significantly in itself a comic strip, you know, with the skinny guy gets the sand kicked in his face and then comes back as the hero. These are the impulses for many people behind these stories, and no one wants to admit that they have those kinds of fantasies, I don't think. Part of the appeal for me, though, is that I think those fantasies are much more common than anybody wants to admit. I think dreams of glamour and power and escape are fundamental to our human nature, and to that extent the superhero story speaks to us all. And what fascinates me about them is that they tend to marry those fantasies with explorations of issues like personal responsibility and the nature of good and evil, so that it turns out that despite what critics of the medium often want to say, which is that superheroes offer overly simplified solutions to complicated problems, I think really that's unfair. That when you read the comics, especially the more sophisticated comics, these are meditations on the nature of good and evil of some complexity. The fascinating thing about Superman, for example, as you look at his history, is that you can see changing American notions about what constitutes good almost by the decade. I mean, that's really the most remarkable thing about it, how rapidly these changes occur. So when Superman was invented in 1938, created in 1938 by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, two young Jewish men from Cleveland, they created the most aggressive New Deal Democrat that you could possibly imagine. That's what Superman was. This is a height of the Depression, and they produced a sort of Rooseveltian hero. And when you read the first year of Superman's stories, he doesn't fight aliens or mad scientists. There's no Lex Luthor. The villains are oil companies, corrupt politicians who are in bed with the munitions factories. He's almost like a kind of Ralph Nader on steroids. He destroys an automobile factory that's producing unsafe vehicles in one issue. But he's battling a corrupt elite, and is really on the side of the oppressed and the common man. And then in the 1950s, he becomes almost an Eisenhower Republican, standing for truth, justice, and the American way. In the 1960s, he's a little lost as the value systems of the culture are changing. There's almost no place for Superman in the 60s, and the stories become much more childish and escapist. Still kind of charming, actually, almost surreal. That's when characters like the dog, the Crypto, the super dog, and Bizarro, the reverse Superman, these all get introduced in the 60s. And then in the 70s, there's some real backtracking, an attempt to sort of find his way again in a more complicated world. Now I think the creators recognize that the most remarkable thing about Superman is how good he is. He's supposed to be good. And no one who has powers like that would be that good. And that's the real miracle of Superman when you read the more recent material, his fundamental decency.
It's very clear from what you've just described, giving your brief historical overview, that there really is a kind of a field, emergent perhaps, but a real field of comic studies.
Oh, yes.
Has it been institutionalized to any extent?
No, not really. I think Charles Hatfield, who will be one of our guest scholars, recently wrote about this very topic, and there's a page on his website about this, about comic studies as an emergent field. And one of the things that he points out is that most of the people who do comic studies are people like him and me who entered the academy doing something else. And we weren't hired to teach this material, which means that if we stopped teaching it, then it would go away. Now, I think that there will be enough of an interest that starts to change in the coming years. It's something that I would really like to see. In fact, I would like for the University of Oregon to be a flagship institution in the study of comics. A lot of analogies are usually made to film studies, and I think it is worth pointing out for people who think that comic studies is just a silly and wasteful idea, that enormously successful aspects of popular culture are things we probably ought to look at. whether we like them or not, because they simply from a demographic point of view. But also comics means a lot more than just superheroes. It means a newspaper tradition that goes back to the end of the 19th century. It means multiple genres and a thousand. It's like there isn't any one kind of story that you'll tell through comics any more than there's one kind of story that you would tell in film or through the novel. So that's important to recognize. It's a very broad field in terms of the kinds of things it can engage. It will never be, I think, as large as film studies, because more people go to the movies. Comics right now are quite, in terms of the sort of the floppy monthly magazines that you used to be able to find in spinneracks and the newsagents, that's really a contracting industry. But comics as something that you can now buy in a bookstore, as a perfectly respectable piece of literature, that's a fairly common phenomenon now. I mean, it's actually the graphic novel, I think, so-called graphic novel is the only growth area in contemporary publishing. So these are important signs, I think, that at some point university departments will recognize that to have one or two people specializing in this area is a good thing. I think that it would need to be an interdisciplinary program where you work very close, where someone like me, who's in an English department, would work very closely with some people in the arts department, and that there should be some even practical courses for students who want to learn to draw their own comic pages. There are significant challenges in terms of doing comic art. It's a very hard thing to do. It takes these people who do it and do it well are tremendously talented artists. You've got to make people look the same from panel to panel. You've got to be able to tell a story without confusing people. You've got to be able to draw anything that the writer asks for. You can't just specialize in landscapes or portraits. Or, you know, this is a very demanding form of professional illustration, and I think that there's already there already are schools that teach it. They're just not attached to. You know, there's the Joe Kubert School of Comic Art in New Jersey, for example, which has been around for about 20, 30 years. But they're not attached to these larger institutions, and they ought to be.
And another dimension of this is that it is not uniquely an American phenomenon, right? There's an international piece to this. If you think about the comic industry in Western Europe and France and Belgium or in Japan. And yes.
And they're very different forms, and exactly those are the places a comparative literature scholar could bring to the table an understanding of manga that I wouldn't have. Having said that, the superhero is an American invention. Superman starts that form and starts that genre, and it travels all over the world. It's as important an American cultural export as jazz or rock and roll. Superman is up there with those, and the concept of the superhero is up there with those iconic creations.
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to point out something that clearly has not escaped you, whether it's a fortuitous coincidence or whether you were prescient in this. This particular time is a really good time to be going back and looking at superheroes. There is a connection between the superhero phenomenon and times of economic depression. You mentioned that Superman had his debut during the Depression.
In the 30s,
yeah, can you talk just briefly about the connection of our need for superheroes and the backdrop of a trying socioeconomic time?
It almost feels too obvious, too pat psychologically to say that people seek these forms of escape as comfort. But maybe again, these are things that we shouldn't be ashamed of. You know, human beings are really fascinating creatures. As far as I'm aware, we're the only species that needs to fantasize. That we actually have to spend a certain amount of time every day engaged in daydreaming, and we need to dream at night or we become ill. But it's the awake dreaming that is the most interesting part. I don't know other creatures that do that necessarily, or if we even understand whether that happens, or whether we understand why we need it. So maybe our need for those kinds of fantasies increases. Certainly, to sort of close up the argument with an observation about Superman, when the Smallville television series was first being pitched, it was impossible for the creators to sell it. No network was interested in Superman in the year 2000. And then the events of September 11th, 2001 happened, and the weekend before the Smallville show debuted, and it became the biggest, the most watched debut show on the WB at that time. Suddenly people wanted a Superman TV show in a way that they hadn't wanted 3 weeks earlier. So it seems pretty clear that those connections are that our need for these things is stronger than we're willing to acknowledge.
Very briefly, you've explained to me that there are already periods into which comic book history is organized. There's the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Modern Age. Are we in the Modern Age?
Yes, I'd say so. We're in a, from the point of view of the variety of creativity that's possible in the form, it's another golden age. This is a very exciting time to be doing comics.
Well, I'm curious, Ben, you're raising 2 children. Will you be raising them with comic books as some of their reading material?
Yes,
yes,
absolutely. Yeah.
And anything else you wanted to direct people to? The exhibit at the Schnitzer will be opening shortly after this program first airs. There's an opening on the 23rd, and then of September, 25th of September?
No, 25th of September for the exhibition.
Thank you. And 23rd of October.
and 24th of October for the conference.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I would urge people, we only have the copy of Action 1, which is the first appearance of Superman for the first month of the exhibition. So I would urge people to come early if they want to see that particular piece. That's one of the very few comic books we actually have in the show. Most of this is original art, but we do have on display 2 or 3 very rare key early comic books, and that's one of them.
So come early and then come back.
Yeah, come early, and you will want to come back. Allow time for it because it's a very detailed show. There's a lot of information to take in, and some really exciting works of art.
It sounds really terrific. I can't wait.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming to talk about this.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking with Ben Saunders, Associate Professor of English. He has organized a conference entitled Understanding Superheroes, taking place on the UO campus October 23rd and 24th. Thanks very much for watching.